High on University Avenue, at the heart of Canada's largest city, Toronto General Hospital rises in pale brick and glass, a structure that has watched over this city for nearly 2 centuries. The entrance faces University Avenue directly, framed by wide steps and the kind of institutional solidity that communicates, without a single word, that you are safe here, that the people inside know what they are doing, that the protocols are sound, the ethics reviewed, the patients protected. Walk through those doors, and you enter a world governed by a single foundational promise. First, do no harm. Toronto General Hospital sits at the center of a network of institutions, physicians, federal grants, and Cold War anxieties that made what happened to Harold Blauer not an aberration, but a pattern that crossed the border and operated quietly inside the buildings Canadians trusted most. This is the story of Toronto General. To understand what happened inside Toronto General, you must first understand the world that made it possible. A world in which medicine was experiencing something close to a gold rush, and in which the rules governing what could be done to a patient were, by modern standards, almost non-existent. The year is 1950. The Second World War has been over for 5 years, and the medical establishment is riding a wave of almost euphoric confidence. Penicillin has been mass-produced. Streptomycin is curing tuberculosis. Polio vaccines are in development. The sense that medicine could conquer anything, given enough funding, enough ambition, enough willingness to push, was not hubris. It felt, in 1950, like evidence. The preceding decade had produced more medical breakthroughs than the preceding century, and the people producing them were celebrated accordingly. Psychiatry was desperate to be part of that story. For most of the 20th century's first half, psychiatry occupied an uncomfortable position within medicine, respected in the way that a slightly unpredictable relative is respected, but not quite trusted with the good china. The treatments available were brutal and often useless. Insulin coma therapy, lobotomy, electroconvulsive therapy administered without anesthesia. The discipline was searching, urgently, for something that looked like the biological interventions that had transformed the rest of medicine. And then, in 1943, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann accidentally absorbed a trace amount of a compound he had synthesized, lysergic acid diethylamide, through his fingertips, cycled home on his bicycle, and experienced the first LSD trip in human history. By the early 1950s, the psychiatric establishment was electrified by what LSD seemed to promise. Early studies described something extraordinary. The drug appeared to produce, in a few hours, a state that resembled acute psychosis. To a psychiatrist trying to understand schizophrenia, this seemed like a key that could open a locked room. If LSD could simulate madness, perhaps studying LSD could explain madness, and perhaps the reversal of LSD's effects could point toward the reversal of psychotic illness itself. This was not a fringe theory. It appeared in the most respected journals. It was funded by national governments. It was discussed at international conferences, attended by the men who set the standards of the profession. The logic felt, in 1952, completely coherent. And in Canada, the federal government was listening. The Defense Research Board of Canada had been authorized in 1947 to fund scientific research with national security implications. In the atmosphere of the early Cold War, in which the possibility of enemy agents using chemical means to extract information or control behavior was treated as a serious and imminent threat, LSD was not merely a psychiatric curiosity. It was a potential weapon, and weapons required research. Federal funding began moving toward psychiatric institutions, toward universities, toward the hospitals on University Avenue in Toronto. The world that made the experiments possible was not a world of monsters. It was a world of confident men in well-lit rooms, with government backing and institutional prestige and a theoretical framework that made what they were about to do feel not only acceptable, but important. That is always the most dangerous kind of world to be vulnerable in. The grants were already being written, and somewhere in the stack of paperwork, the question of whether patients would need to know what was being put into them had not yet been asked. Toronto General Hospital did not begin as a place for research. It began as a place for the dying. It was founded in 1812, the same year American forces burned York, the settlement that would become Toronto. In those first years, it occupied a single building near King Street, staffed by a handful of physicians, serving a city that barely existed. Patients arrived with typhoid, consumption, injuries from the frontier. The building had no running water. In winter, the wards were heated by wood stoves that patients sometimes knocked over in the night. What the hospital had, from the very beginning, was the weight of public trust. In a city without reliable infrastructure, without sanitation systems, without the basic mechanisms of public health, the hospital functioned as the last line between the population and catastrophe. When cholera arrived in 1832 and killed hundreds, it was Toronto General that opened its wards and took the dying in. When typhus arrived in 1847, aboard immigrant ships from Ireland, it was Toronto General that stood between the epidemic and the city. The nurses who worked those wards during the typhus outbreak contracted the fever themselves. Several died. The institution absorbed that sacrifice and made it part of its identity. To work at Toronto General was to serve. To be treated at Toronto General was to be protected. That was not marketing language. It was, for most of the hospital's first century, the operating reality. The expansion of the late 19th century reflected a city that had grown from a frontier settlement into a metropolis of ambition. By 1856, the hospital had moved to a new building on Gerrard Street, larger, better equipped, designed by the same architectural firm that would later give Toronto its most imposing public buildings. By 1913, it had moved again, to its current location on College Street, to a building described in the Toronto Globe as the finest medical institution in the British Empire. The operating theaters gleamed. The wards were wide and well ventilated. The outpatient clinics processed hundreds each week. The affiliation with the University of Toronto's medical school made research not a secondary function, but a core purpose. The best students competed for residencies here. The best physicians made their reputations here. And reputation, in medicine, functions the same way that high walls function in a fortress. It makes what happens inside invisible from the outside. What occurs within those walls is assumed to be trustworthy, because the institution is trustworthy, because the institution has always been trustworthy, and because the people who might question it are, by definition, the people who most need its help. That asymmetry between the physician who knows and the patient who trusts was the condition inside which the experiments would eventually operate. In those early years, the asymmetry was benign. The institution used its authority to save lives. The walls of trust that reputation built were, through most of the hospital's first century, earned. But walls built to protect can also be used to conceal. By the late 1940s, the hospital's research programs were expanding rapidly, funded by the new post-war federal investment in medical science. New laboratories were being fitted. New wards were being organized around research protocols. And the question of what a patient owed to that research, whether the act of entering a teaching hospital constituted some form of implicit agreement to participate in whatever the physicians decided was worth studying, was a question that very few people were asking out loud. In 1947, the Nuremberg Code had established that voluntary consent was the absolute prerequisite of any human experiment. It had been written in response to the atrocities committed by Nazi physicians in concentration camps. The Canadian Medical Association acknowledged its existence. No binding domestic legislation enforced it. The distinction between acknowledgement and enforcement is where history always finds its room. No name is more central to the history of LSD psychiatry in Canada than Ewan Cameron, and Cameron's relationship to Toronto General and its network of affiliated institutions illuminates exactly how the experiments spread from one building across an entire national system. But before Cameron, before the CIA, before MKUltra, there was a physician closer to home and farther from the spotlight. A man whose research was funded not by foreign intelligence agencies, but by the Canadian government directly. A man whose name does not appear in most histories of this period. Not because he was unimportant, but because the file that bore his name was reviewed internally, found inconvenient, and quietly set aside. His name was Dr. Harold Kelm. Kelm completed his psychiatric training in the late 1940s, at a time when the excitement around LSD was at its scientific peak, not its counterculture peak, but its legitimate, peer-reviewed, grant-funded scientific peak. He was not an outlier. He was a product of exactly the training his era valued: rigorous, ambitious, aligned with the research priorities of his institutional funders. He read the European literature on LSD psychosis carefully. He believed, as most of his contemporaries believed, that controlled human experimentation with psychedelic compounds was the fastest route to understanding the biochemical basis of schizophrenia. He applied for and received federal funding. The Defense Research Board of Canada's grant to Kelm was not a secret document. It was processed through standard channels, reviewed by a standing committee, and approved in the way that research grants were routinely approved in the early 1950s, with attention to the scientific question being asked and very little attention to the ethical structure of the methodology being proposed. The methodology was straightforward, in the way that methodologies which treat human beings as instruments often appear straightforward on paper. Psychiatric inpatients would be administered LSD. Their responses would be measured and documented. The data would advance the field's understanding of psychosis-like states. The patients were not described as research subjects in any document visible to them. They were described, in the language of the grant proposal, as clinical participants. Clinical participant. The distance between those two words and what they actually meant to the person lying in the bed is the distance this story lives in. Kelm was not operating in isolation. His work was connected, through the network of federal funding and professional association memberships, to similar programs at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute under Cameron, and to at least 2 other institutions in Ontario, where LSD was being administered to inpatients under research protocols that were never disclosed to the patients themselves. The Toronto network was smaller than Cameron's operation in Montreal. It produced less documentation, attracted less attention, and left a thinner paper trail. That thinness is not an accident. When internal reviews began in the early 1970s, the institutions involved had already had 2 decades to manage what survived on paper. What Kelm's records show, in the fragments that remain, is a research program operating with the full knowledge and financial support of the Canadian government. The Defense Research Board knew what was being studied. The Department of National Health and Welfare knew a federal grant had been approved. The University of Toronto's medical faculty knew its affiliated hospital was conducting LSD research on inpatients. Not one of those bodies, at any point during the research period, required that patients be informed of what was being administered to them. The first thing power protects is its own permission to keep acting. And in early 1950s, Canada, medicine's permission to act on its patients without their full knowledge was still, formally, intact. Kelm died in 1971, 2 years before the document destruction. He never faced a formal inquiry. The building that stood at the corner of University Avenue and College Street in 1955 was, by any measure, magnificent. The main pavilion of Toronto General opened in 1913 and was designed at a moment when hospitals were being conceived as monuments rather than merely facilities, expressions of a city's commitment to its own health, visible arguments for civic investment in public well-being. The architects chose a classical revival style: limestone facades, arched windows, a central rotunda whose dome was visible from blocks away. Inside, the main entrance hall was floored in terrazzo, a deep cream color with inlaid geometric borders that caught the light from the tall, east-facing windows in the morning. The ceilings in the public corridors were 14 feet high, creating an atmosphere that was less clinical than ceremonial. The wards were organized around a principle of airflow and light that reflected the tuberculosis-era belief that ventilation was therapeutic. Wide windows, cross breezes, a sense of openness deliberately opposite to the closed and airless conditions that had characterized the disease wards of the previous century. The operating theaters on the upper floors were state-of-the-art by 1913 standards, rebuilt and re-equipped as surgical techniques advanced through the 1930s and 1940s, updated again after the war with the flush of federal funding. The teaching amphitheaters that ringed the clinical floors were filled most mornings with students learning from the best clinical faculty in the country. The psychiatric ward occupied its own wing. It was not the most prestigious wing of the hospital. That distinction belonged to the surgical floors, where the breakthroughs that made it into the newspapers occurred most frequently. But it was well-funded, well-staffed, and connected, through its research program, to the federal grant system that was the most reliable source of serious money in post-war Canadian medicine. The rooms where patients stayed were ordinary hospital rooms: beds, a window, a call button, a chair for visitors. They did not look different before a research session than they did after one. The chart at the foot of the bed documented what the physician decided to document. The nursing notes recorded what the nurses were told to record. The consent forms that patients signed on admission covered general treatment. They were printed on pale green paper, 3 pages long, with signature lines at the bottom of the first and third pages. The language was broad, as consent language of that era routinely was. The undersigned consents to such treatment, diagnostic procedures, and therapeutic measures as the attending physicians may deem appropriate. May deem appropriate. 4 words that will mean something different by the end of this story than they mean right now. The library on the research floor was small: 6 shelves, a reading table, journals stacked in rubber-banded bundles that arrived quarterly from London and New York and Zurich. On one of those shelves, by 1953, stood the bound volume containing Albert Hofmann's original synthesis notes and the early clinical reports from Sandoz Pharmaceutical, the Swiss company that had synthesized LSD and was distributing it at no cost to any accredited research institution that requested it. Sandoz called it Delicid. It arrived in small glass ampules, packed in cotton batting inside a plain cardboard box. There was no special storage requirement. There was no tracking system. The ampules sat in the research lab's refrigerator alongside standard pharmaceutical compounds, labeled in the same handwritten style as everything else. The rooms were clean. The building was beautiful. The equipment was excellent. And somewhere in the administrative correspondence of the early 1950s, in a memo that has never been made fully public, a research committee at a Toronto institution affiliated with the university received the first federal funding approval and signed off on the methodology, which included administering LSD to inpatients whose admission forms said nothing about psychedelic compounds. The memo was filed, the ampules were ordered, and the research began in rooms that looked exactly like healing rooms, because they were healing rooms, and that is why nobody stopped it. The years in which Toronto General occupied the center of Canadian medicine, roughly 1945 to 1965, were also the years in which the hospital was most publicly celebrated. The celebrations were not unearned. The clinical achievements of those 2 decades were real and significant, and they deserve to be described before the darker record is examined, because the prestige those achievements generated is precisely what shielded the research program from scrutiny. In 1950, the cardiac surgery unit performed procedures that had been considered impossible a decade earlier. The anesthesiology department was publishing internationally. The cancer research program, joint with the university, was among the most productive in the Commonwealth. When King George VI underwent surgery in 1951, the surgical techniques used had been developed and refined at institutions whose methodology traced directly back to the Toronto model. The hospital's relationship with the city was intimate in a way that large institutions rarely achieve. Annual fundraising drives in the 1950s drew contributions from ordinary Toronto households in every ward of the city. The Women's Auxiliary organized bazaars and gala dinners and an annual children's program. Local newspapers published patient recovery stories, with permission, as a regular feature. The hospital was not distant and institutional. It was woven into the fabric of a city that was growing rapidly and needed, urgently, to believe that its institutions were sound. In 1953, the Governor General of Canada visited the hospital for the opening of a new research wing. Photographs in the Toronto Star showed him shaking hands with the department heads in a corridor outside the psychiatric floor. The caption read, "Canada's finest medical institution opens its newest chapter." That same year, a patient, a woman in her mid-30s, who had been admitted for what her chart described as reactive depression following a miscarriage, was administered LSD in a session that was not disclosed to her. Her chart, in the fragments available through later access to information requests, notes the drug's administration in abbreviation. The patient's own notes, written in a letter to her sister that was preserved in a family archive and later submitted to a parliamentary inquiry, describe what she experienced as the world coming apart and not being able to find my hands, and a voice that kept talking but didn't belong to anyone in the room. She did not know what had caused it. She thought she was getting worse. The Governor General shook hands 20 feet from her ward the same week. That was what the Golden Age looked like from both sides. From the corridor, a celebration. From the bed, a confusion that had no name because no one had told her what to call it. In 1957, the hospital celebrated its 145th anniversary with a commemorative booklet distributed to donors and staff. The booklet listed every major medical advance the institution had contributed to since its founding. It described the research programs in psychiatry as forward-looking and innovative. It thanked the Defense Research Board and the Department of National Health and Welfare for their generous, ongoing support. The research sessions were still ongoing when the booklet went to print. The first crack in the institutional facade appeared not in Canada, but in the United States. And not from inside medicine, but from outside it, from journalists, from a Senate subcommittee, and from a CIA officer who had grown a conscience at an inconvenient time. In 1953, the same year that the federal grant to Kelm was being administered, and the same year MK-Ultra was formally authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles, a biological warfare scientist named Frank Olson was given LSD without his knowledge at a CIA retreat in rural Maryland. 9 days later he fell, or was pushed, or jumped, and the distinction has never been legally settled, from the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. His family was told he had jumped in a fit of depression. The truth did not begin to surface until 1975, when a Rockefeller Commission report on CYA domestic activities referenced an unnamed government employee who had died following an LSD experiment. The Washington Post connected the reference to Frank Olson's name. His family exhumed his body. A forensic examination found evidence inconsistent with a simple fall. No one was ever charged. But the revelation cracked something open. Senator Frank Church convened the Church Committee in 1975 to investigate CYA abuses. The following year, Senator Ted Kennedy's subcommittee focused specifically on MK-Ultra. In 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner disclosed in testimony that 7 boxes of MK-Ultra financial records had been discovered in a budget office, records that survived because they had been misfiled when Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MK-Ultra files in 1973. Those 7 boxes were the crack through which the Canadian connection entered the public record. The files named the Allen Memorial Institute. They named Cameron. They named the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the CIA front organization that had funneled approximately $69,000 to Cameron's program between 1957 and 1964. They named Subproject 68. What they did not name, and what the Kennedy Subcommittee did not pursue with the same vigor, was the parallel Canadian federal funding stream, the Defense Research Board grants that predated the CIA involvement and continued alongside it. The Canadian government's own contribution to the network of non-consensual LSD research, over $500,000 between 1950 and 1965, flowing through multiple institutions, was a thread that the American hearings pulled only partially. In Ottawa, the Department of National Health and Welfare commissioned an internal review in 1977. The review was conducted by departmental staff. Its findings were classified. A summary was released stating that funding had been administered through normal channels, and that there was no evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. The patients were not consulted during the review. No patient was interviewed. The review examined documents, and the documents available for review were, by 1977, 4 years past the point at which some of them had been destroyed. The crack had appeared. The institution had filled it with paperwork. To understand how any of this continued for as long as it did, you must understand what was actually being done during a research session. Not in the abstract language of grant proposals, but in the specific physical reality of what happened in a hospital room when a patient was given LSD without being told what it was. The sessions typically began in the morning, when the patient had fasted since the previous evening as they had been instructed to, told it was preparatory to a standard diagnostic procedure. An injection was administered by a nurse or a junior physician. The patient was told it was a vitamin compound, or a mild sedative, or simply that it was part of their treatment. Onset began within 30 to 45 minutes. At standard research doses, which ranged from 25 micrograms to as high as 500 micrograms in the more aggressive protocols, the subjective experience of LSD included visual distortions that the patient had no context for, a dissolution of the boundary between self and environment, extreme emotional volatility, cycling rapidly between euphoria and terror, the sensation that the mind had lost its structural integrity, and in higher doses, a complete inability to distinguish the content of the mind from external reality. For a patient already struggling with depression or anxiety or psychotic symptoms, the addition of a powerful hallucinogen produced something that bore no resemblance to a clinical procedure. It produced a crisis. And the crisis took place in a room where the patient was alone, or nearly alone, with no information about what was happening, no framework for understanding it, and no ability to stop it. Session duration was typically 6 to 8 hours. Some protocols ran longer. During the session, research staff observed and recorded. Behavioral notes were taken. In some protocols, patients were asked to describe their experiences verbally, their responses transcribed as data. The transcriptions described experiences that read, in retrospect, less like research data, and more like accounts from people undergoing acute psychiatric emergencies. Fragmented syntax, terror, repeated requests to know what was happening, descriptions of bodily dissolution and existential panic. One transcript, released through an access to information request by a Toronto journalist in 1993 and subsequently cited in a parliamentary brief, contains a patient's repeated question, asked, according to the attending notes, 7 times over the course of 40 minutes. Did you put something in me? Did you put something in me? The attending note records the response given. Patient reassured. Patient reassured. In the sleep deprivation variant of the protocol, patients were kept awake for periods of 24 to 48 hours prior to LSD administration, a practice drawn from parallel research into sensory susceptibility. Sleep deprivation alone produces hallucinations. The combination with LSD produced states that the research notes describe clinically as heightened suggestibility, and which the patients, in the accounts that later surfaced, described as losing their grip on what was real. The electroconvulsive treatments that sometimes preceded LSD sessions in combined protocols had their own aftermath. The brief retrograde amnesia that follows a standard ECT treatment was, in these protocols, extended through repetition. Multiple sessions across days meant that patients sometimes arrived at an LSD research session already unable to clearly remember the preceding days. The amnesia meant that the experience left no clean record, even inside the patient's own mind. That was not accidental. Researchers understood that patients whose memories were compromised by ECT were less able to construct coherent accounts of what had happened to them. The methodology protected itself. In some protocols, the sessions were repeated. A patient might receive LSD not once, but across multiple admissions, each session building on a physiological tolerance that required higher doses to produce the target state. The body's response to repeated LSD exposure was well documented in the research literature. The researchers knew what repeated exposure would produce. They administered it anyway. LSD was not the only compound used. In some documented sessions, mescaline derivatives were added. In others, barbiturates were used to modulate the descent, to control the timing of the peak experience, in ways that kept the patient in the research window the protocol required. The word cocktail appears in one internal memo, applied to the compound combinations, with no apparent awareness of the word's incongruity in a medical document. One patient, in testimony submitted to a 1980s provincial inquiry, described coming back from those sessions feeling like something had been taken out of her, something she had no name for because she didn't know what it was until it was gone. She had been a school teacher. After 3 admissions between 1958 and 1961, she could not manage a classroom. The noise of children, which she had previously described as one of the things she loved most about her work, had become unbearable. She did not know why. She was never told why. But the numbers, even these numbers, the doses, the hours, the sessions, can become something that the mind processes as information without fully receiving as reality. There are people inside those numbers. Their names deserve to be said. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Margaret Annette Dodd was 31 years old in the spring of 1957 when she checked into the psychiatric outpatient clinic at a hospital within the Toronto University network. She was a secretary. She had a 9-year-old daughter named Ruth. She had been struggling since the previous winter with what her family physician described in his referral letter as persistent low mood following the breakdown of her marriage. She was not suicidal. She was not psychotic. She was sad and exhausted, and she had arranged for her mother to look after Ruth while she sought help, because she believed, because there was no reason not to believe, that the physicians she was about to see were operating within the boundaries of their professional obligation to her. She received LSD on her 2nd week of inpatient treatment. She was told the injection contained a sedative compound to help with her sleep disruption. Within the hour she was describing, in the verbatim session note, a conviction that the walls were breathing and that her hands did not belong to her. When she was discharged 6 weeks later, her mother noticed that something behind her eyes had changed. Ruth noticed it too. Margaret had always been the kind of mother who remembered things, the name of every child in Ruth's class, the birthday of the woman who lived downstairs, the specific food preferences of each family member she cooked for. After her discharge, she forgot Ruth's teacher's name repeatedly. She forgot appointments. She lost the thread of conversations mid-sentence, not because she wasn't paying attention, but because the thread was genuinely gone. She applied for compensation through the 1992 federal program for victims of non-consensual LSD research. She was denied. The denial letter stated that her documented case did not meet the threshold of established non-consensual administration. The documentation that would have established it had been destroyed. Margaret Dodd died in 2004 without compensation, without apology, and without ever being told directly what had been put into her in 1957. Ruth confirmed the denial in a 2007 interview with a researcher at the University of Toronto who was compiling the most comprehensive existing academic record of non-consensual LSD research in Canada. That record has not been published. The university's ethics board is still reviewing its release. Robert James Hatch was 44 years old in the autumn of 1959, a former factory foreman who had been admitted to a Toronto area institution following what his admission chart described as a schizophrenic episode precipitated by work-related stress and excessive alcohol use. He was a large, quiet man whose daughter Elaine later described him as someone whose gentleness surprised people who didn't know him. He had a big man's tendency to apologize for taking up space, and a precise memory for technical details that had made him excellent at his work. He received LSD as part of a research protocol over 3 separate admissions between 1959 and 1962. He also received, in the 2nd and 3rd admissions, what his records describe as ACT adjunct therapy, electroconvulsive treatment, administered at intervals that exceeded standard clinical guidelines. After his 3rd discharge in the spring of 1962, Robert Hatch could no longer operate machinery. This was not a coordination problem. He understood, when asked, how a lathe worked. He could describe the process in correct order. But the moment he stood in front of one, the knowledge stopped connecting to his hands. The circuitry between understanding and doing had been broken somewhere, and the break was permanent. He never returned to work. His wife took additional shifts at the department store, where she worked part-time. Elaine, who was 14 in 1962, began contributing to the household budget the following year by taking a weekend job at a pharmacy. She had intended to go to university. She didn't. When the 1992 compensation program was announced, Elaine submitted a claim on her father's behalf. He had died in 1988, before the program existed. Claims submitted on behalf of deceased patients were reviewed under a separate adjudication process. The adjudicator found insufficient documentation. The claim was denied. Elaine Hatch has never received an apology. She said, in the same 2007 research interview in which Ruth Dodd also participated, "They stole his hands from him. He had beautiful hands for a man who worked with machines. He never forgave himself for not being able to work, even though he didn't know what had been done to him. I will never stop being angry about that." Sandra Jean Marsh was 26 years old in the winter of 1963, a graduate student in English literature at the University of Toronto, when she was admitted to a university-affiliated institution for what her charts describe as acute anxiety disorder with paranoid features. She had no prior psychiatric history. She received LSD without her knowledge on 4 occasions over the course of a single extended admission. The sessions were spaced approximately 3 weeks apart. After the second session, she began experiencing what she described in a letter to her academic supervisor, a letter written 8 months after her discharge, the only detailed first-person account from this period that has entered the public record, as a persistent sense of unreality, derealization, the feeling, which did not fully resolve for years, that she was watching herself from a slight distance, that the person inhabiting her body was performing Sandra Marsh rather than being her. She completed her degree. She became an English teacher at a secondary school in Etobicoke. She married. She had a son. But the letter to her supervisor is one of the most precise descriptions in the available record of what non-consensual LSD administration did to a person who was otherwise articulate and self-aware. She wrote, "I cannot explain to you why I feel certain something was done to me during those weeks, because I have no evidence for it. I have only the experience of no longer quite being myself, and the knowledge that I went in, and something came back that wears my name, but doesn't always recognize itself in mirrors." She submitted a complaint to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario in 1986, after reading a newspaper article about the American LSD research program. The complaint triggered an administrative review. The college responded 7 months later with a letter stating that the matter had been reviewed by a standing committee and that no disciplinary action would be taken, as the physician named in her complaint had retired, and the events described fell outside the period for which the college retained jurisdiction. The physician had retired in 1979. He was alive in 1986. He lived in Oakville, Ontario, in a house with a garden he tended in the summers. And he never gave a public statement about his research methodology, and no regulatory body ever required him to. These 3 stories represent hundreds more. There were patients who were institutionalized before the experiments, and institutionalized again in their aftermath, the one directly caused by the other, in ways that were never officially connected. There were patients whose families noticed the change, and were told, when they asked, that these things happen, that psychiatry is not an exact science, that recovery is not linear. There were patients who could not navigate the access to information system, or who did not know the system existed, or who had died, as Robert Hatch had died, before the programs that might have partially acknowledged them were created. Their names deserve to be spoken. The silence that surrounds them is not an absence. It is a choice. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MK Ultra files. The order was personal and direct. Helms knew the Church Committee was coming. He knew what the files contained. On his direct order, thousands of documents were fed into shredders and incinerators. The complete operational record of what had been done, to whom, for how long, and at whose specific direction. It was not perfectly executed. 7 boxes survived, misfiled in a budget office at the agency's Rockville, Maryland facility. Overlooked because their subject headings reference financial records rather than human subjects. Those 7 boxes are the reason any of this is publicly known. In Canada, the destruction was quieter and more bureaucratic, and for that reason, more effective. In 1977, the Department of National Health and Welfare conducted its internal review of the defense research grants. The terms of reference for that review were written by the department itself. The review team was composed entirely of current and former department employees. The patients whose files were being examined were not notified that the review was taking place. A senior departmental official, whose name appears in an Access to Information release from 2003, but whose connection to the specific file was described only as administrative, recommended in an internal memo dated March 1977 that certain grant documentation be reclassified under national security provisions of the Privacy Act. The reclassification was approved. The specific files affected have never been publicly identified. The reclassification was renewed in 1986. The official never faced any formal inquiry. The reclassification order has never been rescinded. What the combination of American document destruction and Canadian administrative reclassification achieved was this: the paper trail connecting specific physicians in specific Toronto area institutions to specific research sessions involving specific patients was made impossible to reconstruct with the completeness that legal standards require. Not entirely erased. Made legally incomplete. Incomplete enough that every subsequent compensation claim, every complaint to a regulatory body, every request for accountability could be met with the same response: insufficient documentation to establish the specific facts alleged. The gap between what happened and what could be proven was manufactured, deliberately, by people who knew exactly what they were manufacturing it to conceal. Not one of those people was ever charged with anything. The truth about what had happened in Canadian institutions entered the public conversation, not through government disclosure, but through journalism, and not gently. In 1980, the CBC's investigative program, The Fifth Estate, broadcast an investigation into the Allen Memorial Institute experiments that was the most detailed public account of non-consensual psychiatric research in Canada to that point. The broadcast named Cameron. It named MK Ultra. It named former patients and their families. It revealed that the Canadian government had received a private apology from the CIA for conducting experiments on Canadian soil, and that the government had kept that apology secret from the patients whose bodies the experiments had used. The reaction was significant, and the accountability was not. In 1984, Canadian victims launched a class action lawsuit against the CIA in American federal court. The case relied on the surviving MKUltra documents. In 1988, 9 plaintiffs settled out of court. Each received $67,000 American. The CIA admitted no liability. There was no apology. The settlement was structured as a nuisance payment. The agency's calculation that $603,000 was cheaper than discovery proceedings. Against the cost of what the 9 plaintiffs had experienced, the years of non-consensual experimentation, the cognitive and emotional damage that in several cases was permanent, the decades of not knowing, the fight to be believed, $67,000 is a number that does not require commentary. Its inadequacy is complete and self-evident. The Canadian government's response unfolded in 2 stages, neither of which constituted a full accounting. In 1986, lawyer George Cooper was commissioned to review the government's role in funding the Cameron experiments. The Cooper report, released that year, concluded that federal funding had been administered in a prudent and professional manner, and that there was no evidence government officials had knowingly funded experiments designed to harm patients. Cooper's methodology for reaching this conclusion did not include interviews with any of the patients who had been experimented on. The report examined documents. The documents available were those that had survived both the CIA's 1973 shredding and the 1977 Canadian reclassification. Cooper's report has been cited in every subsequent government refusal to conduct a broader inquiry. In 1992, the federal government established a compensation program for victims of non-consensual CIA-funded experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute. The program was explicitly limited to the Allen Memorial. It did not cover patients at other institutions in the Toronto network or elsewhere in Canada where parallel federally funded research had occurred. 77 patients received 100,000 Canadian dollars each, on the condition that they sign a release relinquishing any further legal claims against the government. More than 250 claimants were denied. The denials followed a consistent pattern: insufficient documentation to establish the specific facts of non-consensual administration. The documentation that would have established those facts had been destroyed or reclassified by the same government that was now adjudicating the claims. In 2017, the daughter of a victim who had been denied compensation under the 1992 program received an individual settlement. The settlement was accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement. She is legally prohibited from disclosing its terms or confirming the amount. The mechanism that produced the silence in the 1950s and 1960s was the same mechanism still being used in 2017. The management of what can be known, enforced by legal instruments that dress concealment in the language of resolution. The Senate committee hearings that followed the 1980 broadcast produced recommendations. The recommendations were noted. A subset was studied. The study produced further recommendations. Canada did not pass binding legislation governing informed consent in research settings until 1998, 40 years after the experiments were most active. Cameron never found a cure for schizophrenia. The CIA wasn't looking for one. What the CIA was looking for, and what the surviving MK-Ultra records, the Kubark Manual, and the subsequent history of American interrogation make abundantly clear, was a method. A reliable technique for breaking down psychological resistance, for producing a state of compliance in a subject who would not otherwise choose to comply. The research at the Allen Memorial and the parallel programs in the Toronto network were, from the CIA's perspective, field research toward an operational capability. They found it useful. In the early 1960s, the CIA compiled the Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, a classified handbook for the conduct of resistant source interrogation. The manual drew directly and specifically from the experimental research of the preceding decade. Sensory deprivation, regression to infantile states, the use of pharmacological agents to lower resistance, the deliberate induction of disorientation and helplessness. The logic governing each technique was Cameron's logic, the logic of the sleep rooms and the electroshock and the psychic driving, translated from a psychiatric ward into an interrogation facility. Kubark did not stay in the files. It traveled. In the 1980s, Kubark was revised and updated as the Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, used by CIA officers to train military and intelligence personnel throughout Latin America, in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Chile, in Argentina. The techniques that had been developed in Canadian and American hospital rooms were taught to military forces that subsequently applied them to political detainees, to union organizers, to journalists, to students who attended the wrong political meetings. The forces trained using Kubark methodology were later identified by human rights organizations and by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights as responsible for systematic torture and forced disappearance. The number of people subjected to Kubark-derived techniques in Latin America across the 1970s and 1980s runs into the tens of thousands. The through line from those tens of thousands back to a hospital room in Toronto in 1957 is not a metaphor. It is a documented institutional inheritance. After September 11th, 2001, the inheritance was updated again. The CIA contracted two psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, and paid them more than $80 million to develop and implement enhanced interrogation techniques for use on high-value detainees. The techniques included prolonged sleep deprivation, in one documented case, 180 hours continuous. Sensory deprivation in isolation cells. Confinement in small boxes. Stress positions maintained for hours. Waterboarding. Abu Zubaydah, a Saudi citizen and alleged al-Qaeda associate, was waterboarded 83 times in 19 days. He lost an eye during his capture. He was waterboarded for the first time before the FBI had finished their initial intelligence assessment of him. A 2014 Senate Intelligence Committee report, based on a review of 6.3 million classified documents, concluded that the enhanced interrogation techniques used on detainees produced no unique intelligence, prevented no attacks, and generated no information that would not have been obtained through standard interrogation. They produced nothing of value. They produced an enormous volume of suffering. James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen were sued by the ACLU on behalf of 3 survivors. They settled in 2017. They admitted no wrongdoing. From the hospital room to the interrogation facility to Guantanamo Bay, the same logic, the same techniques, the same gap between what was done and what was faced as a consequence. The building at the corner of University Avenue and College Street still stands. The original 1913 limestone facade is still visible from the south approach on University Avenue, though it is now flanked by later additions. A glass and concrete tower from the 1950s on the east side, a further addition from the 1990s on the west, that have changed the building's silhouette significantly. The central rotunda's dome, which was a landmark of the city's skyline for the first 4 decades of the building's existence, was removed during a 1960s renovation. The terrazzo floor in the main entrance hall survives. It is covered in places by industrial carpet runners, taped at the edges, worn through in the center where traffic is heaviest. Inside the older wings, the 14-foot ceilings are intact, though the plasterwork has been repainted so many times that the original detail of the cornice work has partially filled in. The original wide windows remain on the north face of the building, now divided by aluminum frames installed in the 1970s. The wards that occupied the east wing during the research period were converted to administrative office space, sometime in the 1980s. The rooms where research sessions occurred are now meeting rooms. They have no plaques, they have no markers, there is nothing on any wall to indicate what happened in those rooms. The psychiatric departments of Toronto General and its associated institutions have been reorganized and rebranded multiple times since the 1960s. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, now operates as the primary psychiatric institution in Toronto, the result of a 1998 merger that brought together 4 organizations with histories of federally funded research in the relevant period. The institutional lineage is continuous. The institutional acknowledgement of what that lineage contains is not. CAMH has a patient rights framework, an ethics board, an informed consent protocol that meets current standards, and a formal commitment to trauma-informed care. It has a small museum documenting the history of psychiatric treatment in Ontario, which includes acknowledgement of past practices, including lobotomy and insulin coma therapy. LSD administered without consent is not among the practices documented in that museum. On the wall of an administrative corridor in one of the older buildings within the network, a corridor that is not accessible to the public, there is a photograph of a research team from the late 1950s. It shows 8 physicians in white coats. They are smiling. Their names are printed below the photograph on a small card. 3 of those names appear in the fragments of research documentation that have entered the public record in connection with non-consensual LSD protocols. None of those 3 physicians were ever formally disciplined by any regulatory body. 2 died with their professional reputations intact. The third is still alive, in his 90s, in a city not far from Toronto. The photograph is still on the wall. The names are still legible. There has been no full public inquiry into the scope of non-consensual LSD research in Canadian institutions outside the Allen Memorial. There has been no government-funded effort to identify all patients who may have been affected. There has been no national memorial. There has been no formal, public, unconditional apology from either the federal government or any of the institutions involved. The 2003 Access to Information releases were partially redacted. The 1986 reclassification has not been reversed. The files that were reclassified in 1977 remain reclassified. There are two Toronto generals in this story. The first Toronto general is the institution that carried wounded soldiers through the War of 1812, that opened its wards to the typhus-stricken Irish immigrants in 1847 and watched its own nurses die of the fever they contracted in service. The institution that pioneered surgical techniques, that trained generations of physicians, that was woven so deeply into the life of the city that its fundraising drives drew contributions from ordinary households in every ward. That Toronto General deserved its reputation. The trust it earned was earned through the deaths of people who chose to give their lives to the work of keeping others alive. The second Toronto General is the institution that housed, funded, protected, and afterward concealed a research program in which patients who came seeking help were used as experimental subjects without their knowledge or agreement, not by rogue actors working without institutional sanction, by credentialed physicians operating with federal grants, departmental approval, and the implicit protection of an institution whose reputation was so formidable that the people most harmed by it found it nearly impossible to be believed when they said what had been done to them. The first Toronto General was built on sacrifice. It was beautiful. It saved lives. The worst it represented was the inequality that determined whose lives were worth the most resources and the most care. The second Toronto General decided that some patients' consent was less important than a researcher's question. It systematically obscured what it had done. It denied compensation to the people most harmed. It deployed the legal instruments of settlement and non-disclosure to manage the public record of its own conduct. The worst it did was take from people the fundamental assurance that the physician who held a needle in their direction was acting in their interest. Those two institutions occupy the same building. That is the most precise and troubling thing that can be said about them. The questions that remain cannot be answered by anything in the public record, because the public record was deliberately made incomplete. How many patients in total received LSD without their consent in Canadian institutions between 1950 and 1968? The official estimate, based on the surviving documentation, runs to several hundred. Independent researchers have suggested the actual number is higher. The gap between those two figures cannot be closed, because the documents that would close it were classified or destroyed. Who authorized the specific protocols at institutions outside the Allen Memorial? The surviving, grant approvals name government bodies and institutional research committees. They do not name the individual physicians who designed the session protocols, or the administrators who approved them for their specific institutions. Those names are in files that are still not fully public. Will there ever be a full accounting? A 2019 petition, signed by 4,000 Canadians, calling for a national public inquiry, was received by the government, reviewed by a parliamentary committee, and referred to a subcommittee for further study. The subcommittee's report has not been released. Will there ever be an apology, unconditional, public, complete, from the institutions and the government whose funding made the experiments possible? There has not been one yet. The patients who are still alive and still waiting are, at minimum, in their 70s. Some are older. Margaret Dodd's daughter, Ruth, still has the denial letter from 1992. Sandra Marsh's letter to her academic supervisor is in a university archive that is not open to the public. Elaine Hatch still lives in Toronto. She said, "I will never stop being angry about that. The consent form, that pale green piece of paper, 3 pages long, with signature lines at the bottom of the first and third pages. The language broad and comprehensive. Such treatment, diagnostic procedures, and therapeutic measures as the attending physicians may deem appropriate." A patient signed it, because they trusted the institution they were entering, because the word appropriate carried, in that institutional context, the accumulated weight of everything the hospital had done to earn its reputation, because the form was presented as a formality, standard, necessary, a legal protection for both parties. It was a legal protection for one party, and it was not the patient. The consent form, as it existed in 1957, was a piece of paper that was supposed to mean everything, that was supposed to be the formal expression of the patient's autonomy, the boundary that a physician could not cross without the patient's explicit agreement. It was the document that separated medicine from assault, the document that, in theory, made the hospital room a place of partnership rather than subjection. For the patients in these rooms, in these sessions, it meant nothing. Their names were on it. Their autonomy was not. The consent form has been revised. The language is now specific. The protocols are now reviewed. The ethics boards now exist and now function, mostly, in the way they are designed to function. The form that a patient signs today is a different document than the one signed in 1957. But the lesson of what happened, the lesson about what institutions do when reputation and accountability are misaligned, about what physicians do when a research question feels more urgent than a patient's right to know what is being put into their body, about what governments do when the answer to a parliamentary question is more convenient than the truth. That lesson does not expire with the form. The Tower of Toronto General still rises on University Avenue. The building is still trusted with the city's most vulnerable. The consent form still means everything. Some houses are built to heal the suffering brought to their doors. Others decide, quietly and with institutional permission, that some of that suffering is more useful than it is obligatory to relieve. Toronto General has been both. And the patients who knew it as the second kind never stopped waiting to be told that what was done to them had a name, and that the name was wrong. They are still waiting.